It's Dr. Chris Voss and Dr. Katherine Arnade. Arnade. Oh, okay. Chris is a retired ecologist and former researcher at IMS. She's the force behind the North Carolina King Tide Project, which I think we all know documents flooding events through photos. Katherine is an environmental researcher at NC State and is responsible for the Sunny Day Flooding Project, a study that began back in 2021 and focuses on measuring, modeling, and better understanding chronic flooding.
All right. Well, thank you. All right, so this talk's supposed to be about a reality check, what's happening within our communities, and I'm going to have to... So the beauty and abundance of water is what really defines these communities. And I have to take a minute to say, I'm a resident of Carteret County too. And what's happening here down east, really, the whole county is interested in this. You all are experiencing it first, but we're all in the same boat, literally. But it's these are some aerial photographs we got to take with the King Tides Project, and you guys know what it looks like. But I thought maybe the aerial photographs would kind of help you take a different perspective, and you really realize how much water there is, and that water is what is our connecting feature. There's just another one. This is was Davis. That's okay. Miss Davis looking on up to Stacy. That's better. Thanks. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to take you to a very basic level and talk about what is forcing water levels. If you look at the entire Atlantic coast, you will see a range of different tidal amplitudes. And the tidal amplitude off the North Carolina coast is what the geologists would call a microtidal system. We only have about 3 foot between high and low tide at Beaufort Inlet. Maybe that's about 4 foot at Wilmington. But it is, in some cases, it's the tides that are affecting our water levels. And where we have our barrier islands and relatively few inlets, as you all know, the wind is really important in affecting water levels. The wind direction, speed, and duration. Here are some data from 2 study sites I had. One was at Pine Knoll Shores Aquarium. The other was at Lola Road in Cedar Island. And the blue lines are water levels. This is the same time period. The black lines happen to be temperature. And you can see the variation in this small geographic area and how water levels differ in their patterns. And that is important. At Pine Knoll Shores, the astronomical effect, basically the tidal effect, explained only 59% of the difference between water levels. At Lola, that was only 23%. These data are from 2006, and as the sea is rising, this is probably increasing. So depending on where you are in North Carolina, you have to think about water levels. It's not just looking at the tide charts, because that astronomical forcing is an important factor, but the meteorology is also really important. Another factor, I study coastal habitats, and I was trying to understand this whole phenomenon. And the Gulf Stream, which comes up from the Florida and heads on up, as you can see here, and it's a very strong current. It sits, I'm told, about a meter above surrounding sea levels. And so this wall of water generally holds its longitudinal position down here in Florida. As it comes up by our coast, it wobbles longitudinally. And sometimes it'll push this wall of water up against our coast, and sometimes actually pull water away. So when we go to the actual tide gauges, and it's like, how come water isn't what it was predicted to be? That is also part of the formula. So there is the tide, the wind, the Gulf Stream. This is a picture I just found in my email this morning from NASA Gulf Observatory. And they were commenting on how fast Hurricane Lee gained strength. Now this is a different sea surface temperature legend, but just to give you an idea, this is how darn warm the Atlantic Ocean is, and it's scary. These are some of the changes we're seeing. I also, if we could go back one, You heard the fishermen talking about the cold Labrador Current coming down to Cape Hatteras and the Gulf Stream coming up. And it's this conversion. Here in North Carolina, we're really between the semi-tropical area and a temperate zone. So we are right at the crux. We're kind of at the line, both on land and on sea, as far as what species are there. We have great biodiversity because of it. Okay, 2, please. So water level dynamics. We've been measuring water level many different ways. And yes, water levels are rising. And wanted to explain that it's in some part the addition of water from melting ice from land and thermal expansion. The fishermen especially know this time of year when the water levels are so darn warm, water levels are higher. I mean, part of the whole sea level rise story is just the thermal expansion of water. Okay? Please. Now these graphs, I don't plan to explain all these details to you, but I want to get the point across that these astronomical harmonics that's causing the tidal forcing are very complex, if you will. There are many different patterns. The longest tidal harmonic is called the lunar nodal, and that's about 18.6 years. Because of that, NOAA looks at water levels in 19-year epochs. So to get all of those different fluctuations in just the astronomical components, you have to really look at 19 years of water level. So it's quite complex. And this is just to give a quick sampling of, just to get the idea of the complexity of the difference in patterns in what is forcing our water levels. Okay. So last year, many of our federal agencies published a report saying that water levels are expected to rise within the next 3 decades. So that's by 2050. Most of us will probably be here then. And that difference for the East Coast is about 10 to 14 inches. And that's kind of hard to comprehend, but this is an up-to-date forecast. We do have resources to help us see what those changes will look like. We actually took a diagram later of the sea level rise viewer from NOAA. I highly recommend this. You can just look at home on your computer. You can zoom in and actually change water levels. And these data are based on LIDAR of the elevation of the land. And if you raise the water level up, you can see where the low elevation spots are, basically. Some of these pictures were submitted from the King Tides Project. I believe the first 3 are from the Davis area and then the Atlantic area. Just to reiterate, a king tide is something that has always happened. It's very predictable. It is when we have basically a spring tide during perigee, and perigee is just when the moon is physically closest to the Earth in its elliptical orbit to Earth. So the moon really pulls on the water. We have extra high tides and extra low tides. We use those high tide events to help us visualize what future higher sea levels will look like. So as scary as this is, it's kind of giving us a glimpse, thank gosh, very temporary, of what future higher sea levels will look like. So I think Katherine had an excellent idea here in looking at what 6 inches, we've had about 6 inches of sea level rise in the past 20 years. So within the next 30, up to 2050, what the federal reports were showing us, we've raised water level about a foot here. So that's the mean between 10 and 14 inches. And you can actually go to the website and look yourself. You can zoom in and out. But this gives you an idea of what we can anticipate water levels will be in about 2050.
How granular can you drill down? Like, can you see individual tracts, or
you can probably see tracts of land. You can see neighborhoods. They only go but so far, but you can definitely find you can look at, yes.
And what's around you in your community.
Yes.
Okay.
And again,
is available now.
This has been available now, for quite some time. It's NOAA's Sea Level Rise Viewer. There's other tools available too, but I just find this one's really handy when I'm working, I know, in my local community to try to talk to people and say, all right, well, let's look at what's going to look like in the future. So a point that we want to make here is that all is not lost by 2050. There will be changes, but there is still a lot of land left as well. Next, please. Some of the other changes we're seeing are caused by storms. We're having more and stronger tropical storms and nor'east storms. This happens to be from 2017 because that was a banner year for hurricanes. And then I know on my cell phone when I'm checking the National Hurricane Center, I'll sometimes just be amazed at how many storms are out there at once. Actually, this was Idalia that ended up coming up. It hadn't even been named at that point. But you know, we know that we're going to have more storms. We're going to have stronger storms, and the nor'easters are part of that. This is a map. Really, it's just the precipitation that occurred through Hurricane Florence. You all are familiar with this, but these flashier precipitation events are to be expected, and it's amazing to me how well the models have predicted what's actually occurring. They've been doing this for a couple of decades now, and we are in an area where we need to be able to plan to have, you know, an 8-inch rainstorm, and that's just what we need to be ready for. The King Tides Project, as I mentioned, tries to look at these king tide events and help people visualize what future sea level rise will look like. This is back from 2015 when the project got started. This was the Seafood Festival. This is a water level chart. Blue is predicted water levels, green are what actually occurred. And this up here is actually the minor, moderate, and major flooding is put out by the National Weather Service. So the picture, the image you see there is from the point where the arrow is. So that's just getting to be a moderate amount of flooding. It's scary, but these federal agencies are trying to help us understand and anticipate what a given number of storm, a certain level of water will look like in our community. Okay? So this is, oh, sorry, that's okay. So to me, one of the biggest take-home messages is you guys are seeing the changing environmental conditions are basically integrated in your landscape, and I'll say in your seascape as well. The community is seeing these changes, and there's a lot of complexity. As Emily said, a lot of confounding results. It's just there's many things going on at once. So warmer temperatures. I thought it was pretty neat to hear the fishermen this morning saying yes, species are moving. Okay. The higher hydraulic head of the oceans. This is basically sea level rise, but it was Stan Riggs at ECU that really helped me understand this. When we think of land and we think of the rising sea, we most often think about the horizontal movement of water over the land. And that's only part of the story. We need to think of the ocean as the hydraulic head of the ocean actually pushing up, also on the land, on our aquifers, on the groundwater table. And even though these changes are fairly small, this is the hydraulic head of what is covering 72% of the earth. As the seas rise, there's certain things we can do, but we're gonna have to adapt. Higher groundwater table, as I mentioned, due to sea level rise. This is just an old map from 1988 of Cape Lookout, and the sea levels have been rising really for thousands of years, but those rates of rise have increased. So here's when Shack was connected to Cape Lookout, and here's from 1966. I mean, we have been observing the changes. The community and your forefathers have been seeing these changes. Salt intrusion has been discussed at length this morning. This is a big deal. Higher salinity in our estuaries. Again, the hydraulic head of the oceans, that salty ocean is higher. There's more push of water and salt in toward the land. The poleward migration of species. So there's a group of us who study marshes here, and we use something called a surface elevation table, you can go to look at very small changes in marsh. And we use this thing called a surface elevation table. That's a little diagram to explain the changes we're looking at. But we also have to look at what the water levels are doing. And so, one more, please. So published online is the historical record of water levels of Beaufort, a rate now of 3.4 millimeters per year. So that's about the thickness of 2 nickels. It doesn't seem like much. And that's looking from 1953 to 2022. Well, our group installed these instruments in the field in the early 2000s. So we wanted to go and look at the time period that we have had our equipment in the field. And so just taking the exact same data from Beaufort, when you look from 2002 to 2020, the rate of rise of the seas is 8.8 millimeters per year. We're measuring marshes in a lot of different habitats, a lot of different settings. Marshes have been able to keep up with historical rates of sea level rise. Probably can compete here. When the rate of rise is that fast, we are losing marshes. So the marshes need to either move upslope or we're going to be losing them. Okay. Human adaptation. I just wanted to put up there, and I'm so glad to hear so many people talking about that today, because really humans are the most adaptive species on Earth, and we have lots of potential. We're going to need that. So as you have this very low-sloped land, if you have a forested area at the water edge, and as the salt intrudes on those roots, and as the higher water levels are flooding those roots more frequently, the trees will eventually die. That area tends to become then a shrub-scrub area, then a marsh, then open water. And these were some images from Google Earth that are not fantastic, but between Davis and Stacy. And over time, you can actually see the landscape moving relative to the highway. Habitats migrate upslope in response to higher water levels, in response to sea level rise. If something like a marsh cannot accrete or build itself vertically to be flooded only part of the time, it then basically has to move itself or transgress upslope. That's what we're seeing happening all over the place here. And here are some more aerial photographs of ghost forests, and these happen to be isolated. They've got water all the way around, so those particular areas are going to go, those trees are done. This is just a few more pictures from the King Tides project. This was actually taken in November of 2022. But this is Beaufort. You can see water on Front Street here. Okay. Here's the Davis area. You can see those mosquito ditches and some of the marsh. Some of the marsh is inundated. There's the mouth of Jarrett Bay. And there's sea level. You can see quite a bit is underwater. And you can see open ground farms in the background. Some of that is the highest land here down east. And I think that's all of my part.
Okay, so Chris, Chris gave a broad introduction on the factors that contribute to water levels in ocean water bodies. But how do we actually predict or estimate when it's flooding on land due to sea level rise? Well, we use tide gauges. So in this schematic, I have a tide gauge that's located over an open water body, a bay, over the ocean. And from the tide gauge, we estimate, or we use this reading as a proxy for when it is flooding on land. And in this schematic, I'm showing a tide gauge that's near a more urban area that has a stormwater network that was built a long time ago when sea levels were lower. And that network was built to convey rainwater to the ocean. But now in this schematic, we have sea level rise, we have tides, we have everything that Chris just talked about that adds to the total water level, comes up through stormwater networks and floods roadways. So using this tide gauge data, we can estimate now and into the future when we might have floods due to sea level rise. And in particular, we focus on high tide flooding. And from these tide gauges, we know that high tide floods are increasing in frequency along the Atlantic coast. So what I'm showing here is the number of days per year predicted for high tide flooding from the Beaufort gauge from 2020 to 2100. So taking into account different projections for sea level rise. This is the best case scenario on the left and the worst case scenario on the right. So for Beaufort, it's 2023. Our predictions from tide gauges show just a handful of high tide flood events per year. By 2050, we're in the teens, best case. Worst case, now we have just a handful per year. Worst case, by 2050, upwards of 100 high tide flood days per year. Next slide. So tide gauges were not intended to be used to predict flood frequencies into the future. They were built to monitor tides and water levels. They do not capture flooding due to rainfall, like I'm showing here, or flooding from high groundwater, or the role of infrastructure networks. So here I'm showing the stormwater system, but this also includes ditches in the case of down east. Next slide. So I co-lead a project called the Sunny Day Flooding Project, and our goal is to monitor how often it is flooding on land due to sea level rise. We started in Beaufort, and to measure these floods, we wanted to measure floods on land and not just rely on tide gauges. So we created these sensors that can measure water levels in storm drains and also take photos of the roadway. And our first installation was in Beaufort. These sensors can measure, water coming up through stormwater networks, and they can also measure, next slide, contributions from rainfall, and in some cases, groundwater. Next slide. So in 2021, we installed our first sensor in Beaufort. This is what it looks like. This is our water level sensor in the drain. It communicates in real time. The camera also communicates in real time and has proven really useful for community members to look and see if the roadway is flooded. So we're in Carolina Beach, we're in Beaufort, we're in New Bern, and now we're in Down East. It's okay, go ahead.
Doing what it wants to do.
This is a GIF, or a movie from Beaufort showing water coming up through the stormwater networks and flooding local businesses. We showed just the most recent image on our website. The website is publicly available to everyone. And then we also showed time series, but I recognize that time series are not very useful. These images are really useful for communities. So we also found, over the past couple years in Beaufort, we found that water levels tracked, or flooding tracked pretty well on sunny days with the local tide gauge. It was doing a good job at estimating when there would be flooding on land. But on rainy days, it couldn't capture those contributions. So this is a photo of some flooding in the parking spaces on a rainy day. Next slide. So Beaufort is your closest tide gauge in Down East. This is the number of flood days from 2019 to 2023 that were observed in blue and measured in red, just using the tide gauge. So my question in working with Karen here in Down East was, okay, how does the flooding estimated by the Beaufort tide gauge accurately represent flooding in Down East? We know in Beaufort, it doesn't capture these rainy day flood events. What does it not capture in Down East? Did it flood more than 6 days in Down East last year due to high tides alone? So, next slide. Just 2 weeks ago, we had king tides, the high side tides of the year, impact coastal communities across the state. These are some photos from our sensors in Beaufort and Carolina Beach, and these were taken or provided to us from Karen of areas in Down East. Flooding looks very different across the state for all of the reasons that Chris talked about. Next slide. So what we're doing is we're installing our sensors, our water level sensors, our camera sensors across Down East in flood hotspots that were identified by Karen and others. So right now we're in sea level, We're adding another sensor on the way to Cedar Island in a low spot. It's actually going to be farther up here. At Croker Street in Davis, and then down at North River, we're actually putting out on this side. Next slide. So with these sensors, we're trying to understand how often it's flooding in Down East and why it's flooding in Down East, outside of extreme events, so floods due to sea level rise. So Down Easters know it floods all the time. What is all the time? Can we quantify that? Can we put a number to it and provide evidence that you can use as a community when trying to seek funds for mitigation strategies? Next slide. As a scientist, I want to know also what's the role of wind, rain, your ditches, the marsh, sea surface temperatures, groundwater. How does this contribute to floods on your roadways? So this is an image of the sensor in sea level. So we put our sensor in the marsh. It's so long because we need it to communicate in real time. So this is how it communicates up here in the head. This is where it senses the water level down below. And we show these time series of water levels on our website. Whenever the blue line goes over the red line, that means the road right next to it is flooded. Next slide. So scientists were using these water levels to make numerical models to try to simulate flooding in your community. But the data itself and the images can be used by the community. This is an image of flooding from this last king tide cycle. In sea level, you can see the water extent, the brown line. So you can look at the images and see if the roadway is flooded, how long it's flooded, where it's flooded. Again, you can use this information to provide evidence and grants to the county, to state agencies. And you can also work with scientists like us to model these different scenarios into the future. Next slide. All right, so the meat. We've had this sensor installed in sea level since April 2023, so 5 months. Since then, we've measured water levels, or 32 instances of water on the road in 5 months. That's any amount of water on the road, meaning any amount of water that you can kick up underneath your car when you drive through it. The maximum depth was about a foot above the road. And that was actually during the photo, or the flood of the photo on the previous slide. Only 13 of those floods were during a predicted king tide event. So that means 60% are not predicted by the Beaufort tide gauge. So it's flooding when we might not expect it to, which I'm sure you guys as Downeasters know. It really is flooding all the time. How does that compare to elsewhere in North Carolina? Over 12 months, so from April 2022 to 2023 in Beaufort, we observed 65 instances of water on the road. That's over 12 months. So we'll see what the next 7 months look like in Down East, but you're tracking pretty well with Beaufort. Again, one sensor. In Carolina Beach, we measured about 45 instances of water on the road with some data gaps. So this provides some context of how you compare throughout the state, the number of times that your roadways are inaccessible. And I really like this photo. This is actually a fox and a flood. All right, next one. So the Sunny Day Flood Project, we're committed to learning about flooding in Down East and collecting data that's useful to your community for as long as we can. The sensors will be there for at least 5 years. And right now we only have these 4 sensors planned, but that may expand into the future. And I would love to talk to anybody in the community if you think that we're not actually capturing some flood hotspots. The next slide.
So there's not one in Marshallburg?
There's not one in Marshallburg.
Could we get one in Marshallburg?
Yes, we could get one in Marshallburg. He's your man to talk to right there. So the flood data are being used by a large team of scientists across the state and nation. Can we go back really quick? We have a lot of funding agencies, including NCDOT, NASA, NOAA, NSF. A lot of people care about what's going on in this region. Next slide. And are we out of time? Do I have time to go through these? Like I said, all of our data are publicly available in real time. We have stickers over here at our little booth, and we actually have our camera sensor and water level sensor, and I'd love to show them to you, or Ryan would love to show them to you. And I had a bunch of other slides about all the science projects we're doing, but do I have time to talk about them? I don't. Whoop, sorry. All right, thank you.